In this Diablo 4 video, I'm going to be showing you my Grim Reaper build. This is a tier 4 Solo Necromancer build that's aimed at level 70 plus, and this is an evolution of our Reaper build that we used for World Tier 3. So the general strategy with this build, if you remember that build, is to use Blighted Corpse Explosion to put shadow damage over time on enemies, stack up this shadow damage over time to trigger the Shadow Blight passive, and also just deal lots and lots of damage. And for my core skill, I'm using Sever, and what Sever does is it deals damage to the target, and it also deals some of that damage to enemies caught in the path of your scythe as you throw it out, and every fourth cast it puts vulnerable on enemies. So there are a few reasons that I use Sever in this build and not Blight. People might be wondering, why are you not using Blight here? Blight does shadow damage, and shadow damage over time. You can get the aspect that pulls enemies in. This would fit perfectly in this build. Well, there are a few things that Sever does for us that Blight doesn't. First, we get burst damage. Blight is pretty much damage over time, or Corpse Explosions are damage over time. And when you're talking about clear speed, you want things to die quickly, so getting some burst in there is really nice. Additionally, Sever has exceptional range. It can clip through multiple enemies, so if you're trying to hit that one enemy at the back that's, buffing all the other enemies, making them damage resistant, you can do that with Sever. And additionally, it attacks faster, and it can apply Vulnerable every fourth attack. And Vulnerable is a huge part of damage in Diablo 4. Ideally, you would have Vulnerable damage on both of your rings with this, and your weapon if you're not using Black River for this build, in order to get the most out of your Vulnerable. And at some point, probably the next glyph that we put into this build, we'll be putting the Exploit glyph in to further boost Vulnerable damage. So the general strategy for most fights is you're going to walk in and you're going to use Acolyte's Reap in order to drop a corpse, and then you're going to hit Corpse Tendrils to pull in enemies, stun them, and apply Vulnerable to them. And because we're using the aspect of Grasping Veins, this is going to boost our critical strike chance for 6 seconds, and it's also going to boost our critical strike damage against enemies hit by tendrils. This boosts your damage a lot, particularly if you drop Corpse Explosion afterward. Then when enemies are all grouped up, you're going to hit them with Sever until they start dying, and once corpses are on the ground, you're going to start using Corpse Explosion, put more dots on the things that are still alive, while you continue to reapply Vulnerable with Sever in order to keep Vulnerable on them while they're standing in those AoEs. And I'm also using Blood Mist here, and Blood Mist is phenomenal in this build. Not only does it give you a way to get out of bad situations by making immune, you can use it to kite into enemies, and we have both aspects for this here. One of them allows it to consume corpses while it's moving around, which is fantastic, because we not only drop corpses because of the upgrade we have, but then this is going to put shadow damage all over the ground. And one of the nice things here is if you have Black River, which we're using in this build, it's going to consume up to 5 corpses at a time. So if you drop a bunch of enemies and then things look dicey and you hit it, it's going to start popping for huge damage on those enemies as you move through them. And also the other upgrade makes it so that we deal, or other aspect rather, makes it so that we deal shadow damage as we move through enemies, and it increases our speed. This one is absolutely optional. You don't have to have this one, but I would absolutely take the one that consumes corpses and reduces its cooldown, because you want it to come off cooldown quicker and deal damage while you're moving around by consuming those corpses, which also replenishes essence, by the way. So as you consume those corpses, you're going to gain essence back. So it's a nice move to do when you're out of essence. Now, if you don't use that aspect, you'll probably want Aspect of Ultimate Shadow, which will make it so that your Bone Storm deals shadow damage, and that thing absolutely cranks out shadow damage when you have it up. It's kind of overkill at this point, but you'll probably want to swap these two around as you get further and further into your Nightmare Dungeon tiers, because you'll probably need Bone Storm for most elite pulls. And then obviously we have Bone Storm, which is great, increases our critical damage, reduces the damage enemies do around us, hits all the enemies around us, and if you use the Ultimate Shadow aspect, it's going to deal shadow damage to the enemies around you, which is great and helps build up that Shadow Blight so enemies, explode for damage periodically. And if you put Aspect of Shielding Storm on one of your armor pieces, you're going to gain a huge barrier when you do this. And we absolutely have this on here. This makes you super tanky, so this is something you want to pop when you go into a dangerous situation. Or, if things aren't looking too dicey, you can pop Blood Mist, and then if they're still looking bad, you can pop Bone Storm. So it's really up to you, but it's a really, really good ultimate for this build. So talking about aspects on my helmet here, I have Aspect of Protector. This gives me a damage shield when I damage elites. This is another way that you, protect yourself. It's really, really nice for this build. And on my helmet, I've got Maximum Essence here, which is great. Maximum Life to give me more health, total armor. These are all really good. You can get cooldown reduction on here if you can find it as well, to further reduce the cooldown of your Corpse Tendrils, Blood Mist, and Bone Storm. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get it on this one, but that would also help. For my chest, I'm using Aspect of Disobedience, which increases your armor up to 50% as you deal damage. We deal tons of damage with this. That's going to make you even tankier. Here again, you want to look for total armor, damage reduction from enemies that are affected by shadow damage over time. Damage, if you can get it. Darkness skill damage is good. I think you can get shadow damage on here as well. So you want to look for like basically damage reduction, armor, and damage that you can get out of it. It's a good mix of that is good. For my gloves, I'm using Aspect of Decay, which makes it so that each time the Shadow Blight key passive deals damage to an enemy, it increases the next Shadow Blight's damage within 10 seconds by up to 40%, stacking up to 5 times. This would be up to 200%. Each time you deal shadow damage to an enemy 10 times, this pops, and it gets more and more. And you'll see, like, during a boss fight, you'll probably notice this the most. Big chunks of a boss's health will just suddenly disappear, and that's when Shadow Blight is popping. And it usually snowballs into more and more and more. So this is really nice to have in this build. Probably won't see it as much in regular trash packs, but you might see it on an elite, like, one time. And on gloves, you're going to want ranks to Sever, attack speed, critical chance, and intelligence if possible. So on my legs, I have Aspect of Shielding Storm, which I mentioned. I also have more damage reduction from enemies that are affected by shadow over time, damage reduction to close enemies, increased damage after killing an elite, and dodge chance. Now, dodge chance is really, really good for this build because one of the ways we keep our essence topped up, besides Corpse Explosion and Black River, is the Assimilation aspect. And what this does is it increases your dodge chance versus enemies affected by damage over time effects. In this case, our shadow damage over time. And when you dodge, you gain 10 of your primary resource. So we want to stack dodge here so that we dodge not only to avoid damage, but also to regain resources back, because the higher your dodge chance, the more likely it is that you're going to gain resources. And this is one of the nice synergies with this build. If you keep your shadow dots on enemies, then you're going to have a higher dodge chance against them, and you're going to gain resources back, keeping you topped up. So my boots, I have Aspect of Explosive Mist. This makes it so that Blood Mist triggers corpse explosions when you're moving around, and each corpse you explode reduces the cooldown by up to 5 seconds. I got a terrible roll here. But this synergizes really nicely with Black River, because this can be up to 5 corpses each time you detonate one, which gives you essence back, which reduces the cooldown even further, and then puts a lot of damage on enemies at the same time, so this is really nice. Now, a really good unique for this build is the Greaves of the Empty Tomb, if you can get it. I was unable to get it. I kept farming for it, couldn't get it. What it has is max evade charges, intelligence, essence cost reduction, lucky hit applies shadow damage over time. You get damage reduction from enemies that have shadow damage over time. But more importantly, it creates desiccated ground underneath your Sever Spectres as they travel, so when you throw out your blade, it's going to put like these dot pools on the ground that are basically going to create damage over time on enemies. So if you throw that into a pack, you're going to stack up even more shadow damage over time, hoping to trigger Shadow Blight more and just deal more damage to enemies. So this is really, really good. And if you can get this, you'll definitely want to use these on your boot section. So then for my main hand, I'm using Black River, and this is excellent for this build. It gives you intelligence, damage to distant enemies, damage to healthy enemies, increases fueled by death, which makes it so you deal more damage after consuming a corpse. And then it makes it so Corpse Explosion deals way more damage, consumes up to 4 additional corpses, and expands the area. This is really, really strong for this build because one of the downsides to not having this is that you have to detonate each corpse manually, and this takes time, right? The animation for each corpse. And it ramps up damage, and it's really, really nice. But this makes it so you can concentrate on using Sever and then pop Corpse Explosion, and then use Sever a bunch of times and then pop Corpse Explosion. You don't have to keep spamming Corpse Explosion, allowing you more time to use Sever. So this build really shines with Black River. You don't need it for this build. It will be less effective without it, but you can still play the build. But one thing I would recommend if you're not using Black River is using another one-handed scythe, and that's because of the life on kill. Life on kill is huge. When you stand there and you're just wailing away on enemies and they're dying and you're tanking damage, you're replenishing your health simultaneously, and it just keeps you alive while you're in the middle of enemies. You sometimes don't even realize that you're gaining life because you stay topped up constantly and your life bar barely moves. But that a big part of that is because of life on kill. So I highly recommend using a one-handed scythe. And if you aren't using Black River here, I would recommend using the Cadaverous aspect. This makes it so that for each corpse you consume, you're going to increase the damage of your next core skill, so in this case, Sever. So as you're using Corpse Explosion to ramp up damage and then you cast Sever, it's going to deal a lot more damage. And then in my offhand, I'm using a Focus here instead of a shield. I actually started with a shield, but there are a couple reasons for this. First, cooldown reduction. You get native cooldown reduction on it, but also because you get more damage this way. And you also have another offensive aspect slot. If you're using a shield, it becomes a defensive aspect slot, and we need more room for our offensive aspect slots. And here I have the Blood-Soaked aspect, which makes it so Blood Mist leaves a trail on the ground doing shadow damage, which is great. That shadow damage is boosted by all our Paragon and stuff. Again, you can replace this for the Eternal Shadow one if you want. It's kind of a toss-up here if you want. Things you want to look for on this are essence cost reduction, critical chance if you can get it. Anything to do with like resource generation or anything that's going to boost your damage really. So on our first ring we have the assimilation aspect, which I mentioned earlier, but what you want to look for on here is vulnerable damage, critical damage, shadow damage, and critical chance if possible. And then our other one, we have aspect of grasping veins, which increases your critical strike chance and increases your critical strike damage against enemies, damaged by corpse tendrils. This on here again, you want similar, looking for things: vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, critical strike chance, shadow damage if possible. And then on the amulet, I'm using the blighted aspect, which increases your total damage for 6 seconds after Shadow Blight triggers 10 times. So this can be huge. You can max roll this at 180%. That's an insane amount of damage. You can trigger this. You usually trigger this like in big trash bowls. And what you want to look for here is ranks to fueled by death if possible, darkness skill damage or darkness damage, or anything that reduces your damage, or ranks to corpse skills to give you more corpse explosion skills, ranks basically. So for Book of the Dead, I have Skeletal Warriors sacrificed for shadow damage, Skeletal Mages for vulnerable damage, and Golem for critical strike damage. So this brings us to the Paragon board, and the first glyph I have slotted in the base board here is Essence. This increases your critical strike damage with your core skill and makes it so that critical strikes deal 22% increased damage to enemies that are below 80% health. This is really good for getting burst damage with Sever. One of the drawbacks of shadow builds is usually they don't have burst, and this is one of the ways we help increase that burst by getting more critical damage with Sever. So then for our second board, we've taken Wither, and what Wither does is it makes it so your shadow damage over time has a 5% chance to deal 50% bonus damage, and then this chance increases by 1%, and the bonus damage increases by 2.5% for every 50 willpower you have. You have a lot of willpower with this build because a lot of the rare nodes require willpower, so this is going to go up. But there's really no other shadow board, so if you want increased shadow damage, this is basically the board you have to take second. And there are a lot of good rare nodes here, but you need to focus on ideally ones that deal shadow damage first, because shadow damage not only increases the damage of Sever, but it also increases the damage from your corpse explosion and your shadow damage over time, because shadow damage encompasses all shadow damage, whereas shadow damage over time only encompasses damage that ticks over time on enemies. So you want to focus on shadow damage first, and then you'll supplement that later with shadow damage over time. So that being said, on the second board, you're going to want to drop darkness into it initially and level up darkness in order to get more shadow damage, because again, shadow damage applies to all sources of shadow damage, whereas Scourge only applies to shadow damage over time. However, I've swapped Scourge here because actually on my third board, I can get more nodes so I can increase shadow damage more, but initially you'll have darkness here. And make sure you get Malediction and the Lingering Shadows rare nodes when you're here. I've skipped some of the blue nodes on the way up in order to get all the things that I want, but I'm going to go back in and fill these in as I get more points. Gnawing Darkness is also fantastic. This increases your damage to enemies that are affected by shadow damage over time, as well as damage to elites. Both of these are really good. So then we move on to Scent of Death, and the legendary bonus is okay. It's not great, it's not terrible, it's just okay. And we're not really focused on the legendary aspect here as much as we are the board itself. For instance, Corrective will give you increased critical strike damage and more potion healing. Critical strike damage, again, good for boosting Sever's damage, even though your dots cannot crit. Sever can, and you want it to crit very hard when it does. Also, Ruin is fantastic. This gives you damage to healthy enemies. This is great for that, lead-off attack with Sever. You want to boost that as much as possible. It also gives you even more critical damage. Also, Deathbringer and Deathmark will increase your damage to injured enemies. These are enemies below 35%, and that might not seem helpful because enemies below 35% are probably going to die in a couple hits anyway. But when your damage over time is doing a lot of your damage with this build, that can make that last 35% go really fast, so the enemies just drop, giving you more corpses, allowing you to generate more damage over time on the enemies that are still alive. And then lastly, I've taken the Bone Graft board, and that's because of the Node Cluster Reinvigorate, which gives you max Essence and Essence on Kill, and there you can get up to 4 Essence on Kill if you take some of the magic nodes around it. This helps with your sustain on your Essence, so between Corpse Explosion, Grim Harvest passive, which gives you Essence back when you consume a corpse, between consuming many corpses at once with Black River, you really, on top of it, between the assimilating aspect, which makes it so when you dodge enemies that have damage over time, you gain essence. You don't have a lot of essence management problems with this build, which is great. So essentially all I plan on doing at this point with the next, 17 levels or so, we'll see exactly how it plans out. But there's a lot of magic nodes I missed in the trees in order to get over here, to get Reinvigorate, that will help improve shadow damage over time. There's some that reduce damage you take with shadow damage over time on enemies. So we'll probably fill that in with the next 25 to 30 Paragon points, and then if there's more points, we might look at another board and, you know, try and move this to the end of that board. So that wraps up the Grim Reaper build. I hope this helped show you how you can play it in World Tier 4. This thing is just even better in World Tier 4 than it was in World Tier 3. You can solo the Butcher in like 10 seconds with this build. Bosses melt with this build. Large packs of enemies melt. You're tanky as hell. Just a really, really strong and fun build to play. Stay tuned for more Diablo 4 build guides as we continue our way through our Tier 4 builds.